Hello, I am Richard Nongard with SubliminalScience.com.
And I'm James Hazlerig, a professional hypnotist and storyteller.
And I'm very happy that you've decided to participate in this online learning series on storytelling and metaphor in hypnotherapy and counseling. This has been recorded before a live audience here in Oklahoma City, and so you will hear some of the participation, some of the input from some of the people who are here in attendance. You are, of course, invited also to participate by asking either me or James a question at any time. And we want you to know, even if you're watching this in our on-demand learning center on your own schedule, you still have the ability to ask us any questions at any time. Our internet forum is actually a Facebook forum, and it can be found at icbchgroup.com. That stands for International Certification Board of Clinical Hypnotherapists, icbchgroup.com. And if you post a message related to anything that James and I are sharing today, James and I will respond to that and be more than happy to clarify or answer any questions. Anyway, we're glad that you have decided to participate in this online learning experience. And now, without any further ado, you can join us in our class here in Oklahoma City. Anyway, I've had the chance to meet most of you at one time or another over the last couple of years. For those who I haven't had the chance to meet before, hi, I'm Richard. It's good to know you. And I'm looking forward to today's presentation, not only because it'll meet your requirement for live continuing education hours, but also because we have awesome content. And in order to make sure we have awesome content, I made sure I brought James along with me. And you guys haven't had a chance to meet my friend James. James is a therapist from Austin, Texas, and we've been friends for a long time. And some of you may be saying to yourself, I'm going to let you introduce yourself here in a minute, but you may be saying to yourself, he looks vaguely familiar. Somehow, I think I've seen that guy before. And in addition to helping people solve meaningful dilemmas and find purpose in the randomness of life, or whatever it is that helping professionals do, he's also at the Ren Fair in Muskogee every April. May, whatever it is. And, so he's actually around Oklahoma every now and then, and James is an interesting person. And he will be joining me for this workshop on storytelling. He's not only an interesting person, by the way, but a master storyteller. So we're going to spend a lot of time today looking at the role of metaphor and storytelling in therapy and how we can actually use it to help people. The cool thing about this workshop is people who attend this workshop sometimes say, but I'm not a great storyteller or a great story creator or a great story writer. I actually don't consider myself to be a brilliant story creator, but I've figured out how to use the stories of others in ways that truly benefit my clients. So I thought the best way for me to begin this workshop would be to actually tell you a story about me telling a story to a client. And this is what happened just the other day. In fact, this was Monday this week. I had a client who was a third session, 62-year-old lady. She came to see me, grief-related issues. She had had a heart attack in the previous year, dealing with a lot of stuff. And the first session went extremely well. The second session went extremely well. And the third session, I'm seeing her and her husband. In the third session, he said, it's like she turned into the Wicked Witch. So I leaned over to my bookshelf, where I happen to have a copy of The Wizard of Oz. And the reason I had The Wizard of Oz is because in this room last May, I did a workshop with Dave Park titled Counseling People Who Have Killed Other People. And I used the story of Dorothy because Dorothy has 2 confirmed kills. The first one when her house lands on the witch and she feels awful about, but the second one, she purposefully kills off that witch because she's got her shoes. So I had that part highlighted because I had done that workshop here and I had shared that story when I was talking about people who've killed other people. And I leaned over to my bookshelf and I said, let me read something for you. And I opened up the book and I already had that part highlighted because I had actually used it at the workshop. And I literally, at my desk, read that part of the story to her. And in what really was a tense situation where she, has had a lot of emotional difficulty, the humor, the lightness, was able to really break through and help her to kind of move forward in that session. The third session went pretty well, and so I was very happy that that book was there and that I'd already marked that book. There are lots of different ways to use story, parable, metaphor in therapy. We're going to share today the many ways to do that. But most of you have met me, so I'm going to shut up and stop talking and let James introduce himself. He's an awesome guy. You're going to love James. So, all the way from Austin, which makes you the expert.
Of course, yes.
There you go.
Hi, I'm James Hazlerig. And as Richard mentioned, I have an office in Austin, and I'm also a professional performer, have been for many years. My background is actually in performance and in literature. I have a master's degree in English. And I came by storytelling very naturally, and that's because I was raised by a man who couldn't stop telling stories. My father told stories constantly, and so I just sort of absorbed it. And that led to me really enjoying the art of storytelling and practicing it. So I would like to start out actually by sharing one of my favorite stories, and I'm going to read it rather than tell it. And though I brought the book, hold that up so that folks at home on the internet can see it, Where the Wild Things Are. Anybody familiar with this book? All right.
Everybody raise your hand.
Yeah.
That's how we can always wait, because if you're not raising your hand,
that was my favorite book as a child. And though I brought a copy of it, I went ahead and printed out the text just to make it a little bit easier to read it to you. Now, the words are only half of it. The art is the other half of that book. So if you ever read that story as a child, or if you ever read that story to your child or to someone else's child, then feel free to close your eyes and picture the art in the book as I read this. The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind and another, his mother called him Wild Thing, and Max said, "I'll eat you up!" So he was sent to bed without his supper. That very night, in Max's room, a forest grew, and grew and grew until his ceiling hung with vines, and the walls became the world all around, and an ocean tumbled by with a private boat for Max. And he sailed off through the night and day, and in and out of weeks, and almost over a year, to where the wild things are. And when he came to the place where the wild things are, they roared their terrible roars, and they gnashed their terrible teeth, and they rolled their terrible eyes, and they showed their terrible claws, till Max said, "Be still!" and tinged them with the magic trick of staring into all their yellow eyes without blinking once. And they were frightened, and called him the most wild thing of all, and made him king of all the wild things. "And now," cried Max, "let the wild rumpus start." And so the wild things, with their terrible claws, lifted Max their king, and stomped their terrible feet, and rolled their terrible eyes, and howled at the moon with terrible howls. Yet Max's howl was the most terrible of all, and his dance the most astounding, as they made the forest shake, and they made the stars to quake with the wonder of the wild rumpus. "Now stop," Max said, "and send the wild things off to bed without their supper." And Max, the king of all the wild things, was lonely. And he wanted to be somewhere where someone loved him best of all. Then all around from away across the world, he smelled good things to eat. So he gave up being king of where the wild things are. But the wild things cried, "Oh, please, don't go. We'll eat you up, we love you so." And Max said, "No." The wild things roared their terrible roars, and they gnashed their terrible teeth, and they rolled their terrible eyes, and they showed their terrible claws. But Max stepped into his private boat and waved goodbye, and sailed back over a year, and in and out of weeks. and through the day and into the night of his very own room, where he found his supper waiting for him. And it was still hot.
That's a dramatic pause at the end.
That is, yes. That's Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak. Now, the copy of that I have, by the way, has kind of an interesting story behind it. About 8 years ago, I was thinking about that book and remembering it, and I commented to a couple of people I knew how much I had enjoyed that book as a child and how I didn't have a copy. So a friend of mine went down to the bookstore and actually bought me a copy. And, excuse me, 'tis the season. And as she was paying for it, she said, "Oh, could I get that gift wrapped?" And I said, "Sure. Is it a present?" And she said, "Yeah, a friend of mine's having a birthday." And he said, "Oh, that's so sweet. How old is he?" 37. Now, I know a few of you are familiar with that story there. As I read that story, did you see the art in your mind? Did you see some of that? Did you notice that I pulled a fast one on you? Some of those words were mine. They weren't Maurice Sendak's. And the reason for that is that if you are really familiar with the book, when the wild rumpus starts, there are no more words. It's all pictures until Max cries stop. And I realized doing a dramatic reading that wasn't going to work. So I had to write a little bit there. I hope not too many people noticed, and I hope that Maurice Sendak doesn't hate me for that, wherever he is.
So send you to your room without any supper.
He could, yes, yes.
When James and I were talking a little bit about how we wanted to structure and how we wanted to plan this workshop, I said, hey, let's start out with a dramatic reading of something everybody's familiar with. These stories, even though they're a children's story that we probably all either had read to us or read to our kids, or at least know people who had it read to them, really are profound in that they bring us instantly from wherever we are to somewhere else. For some of you, reading this story was really pleasant and awesome. Chances are, for some of you, the story was even a little uncomfortable or perhaps even distressing. Storytelling takes us from wherever we are and immediately moves us to somewhere else. And this particular story, as simple as it is and as well known as it is, really is an effective story for a variety of reasons. I think the number one reason on the list is that it's familiar to us. It's familiar to at least so many people. Probably 90% of this room actually had the book read to them or read the book to somebody else, and another 9% of you at least knew what the book was, and probably one of you, for some reason, read The Little Engine That Could instead.
Right. In fact, one of the
Harold and the Purple Crayon.
One of the ways that I use this book in my office is I actually have some of the art framed on the wall. So when my clients come in and they sit down and they look around, they see that picture, they say, "Oh, Where the Wild Things Are." You know, I loved that book. Me too, that was my favorite book. We have instant rapport. And then I can say, you know, that book's really amazing because here's a character who's kind of wild, he's out of control, and he has to be disciplined, and yet he has all of these inner resources. He has this other world within his mind, and it's filled with terrible things that threaten to tear him apart. But he stares them down, and he becomes their king. But they threaten even to swallow him up, and he turns away from them. He gains control, and he does it all so quickly that his supper doesn't even get hot, or doesn't get cold, I should say. It remains hot.
The cool thing about this is, I think often people who come to therapy think this is going to take forever to change. One of the values of storytelling and metaphor is it teaches it teaches something in a way that's different than we could ever teach it. A lot of my clients come to me. In fact, the lady who I saw for the third session the other day, she came and said, "I'm going to need to see you for a long time because I'm in really bad shape." That was what she said in her first session. And I wish that I had a before and after picture of the first session. Because when she came in, she looked like a person who was going to need to come see me for a long time. But when she left at the end of the first session, she looked fantastic. 62-year-old lady, just had a heart attack earlier in the year, dealing with the suicide of a grandson. Lots of things going on with her, limited physical mobility, all kinds of issues. And she came in thinking she was going to be with me for a long time before she was ever going to be okay. To be honest, in the third session, on the way over, I was kind of thinking to myself, wow, she did so great in the first and the second session. What am I going to do with her in the third session? Fortunately, she recognized she needed to produce a crisis in order to have content for the third session. So it gave me an opportunity to point out to her how long it had been between crises. In other words, change for you actually was quick. And this story, through metaphor, actually teaches this. By the way, just so you know, James, that will continue to go dark and it means nothing.
All right, good to know.
Let me back up for a minute. I have a handout, and people are always happier with a handout, so I'm gonna pass this along. And you guys at home, apparently the handout isn't uploaded. And when we take a break, I'll email it to Stephanie because apparently she didn't get the email that I sent her. So you'll have it when we take a break. So just sit tight. You'll have it eventually. There's really nothing in the notes you have to have in order to understand what it is we're talking about or what the goal here is. The notes really are a way for you to follow along with, I guess, what we're going to accomplish today. And so I'm going to back up for a minute and cover a couple of things. Whenever I do a workshop, people often ask, hey, you know, when's our lunch break? What about a break in the middle of the morning or something like that? And generally, most of you know that I usually take a break at the end of each hour. I'm going to change that today. This will be the first time in a long time that I've actually changed that up. And rather than taking a break at the end of each hour, because we're actually recording this, and it's a lot better if I have hour and 15-minute segments on the video. So normally I'll take a 5-minute break at the end of each hour, but today's not the workshop I'm going to do that. We're going to go till probably about 10:20 and take a break for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes in the middle of the morning. We'll come back and we'll go right until almost noon. I know, though, that it's important to beat the Oklahoma City lunch rush and to be at the front of the lunch line. I've been coming here doing training since 1995, and I know the difference between 11:55 and 12:05. And there's probably about an hour between 11:55 and 12:05. So I will, in fact, make sure you are out of here on time for lunch today. I'll make sure you're out of here on time for lunch today. Lots of places to eat around here. And then be back from lunch by 12:59. And then we'll spend probably about an hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes when we come back from lunch, looking at some other elements of storytelling. Take a break for 15 minutes and come back and spend our last hour and 15 minutes together. So that's the outline for today. The other question people ask me is, hey, when will we get our CEU certificates? They're actually piled up over here on the table, so you'll have it before you leave here today. Those of you who are online, when you're done, Stephanie will email you a CEU certificate, so you'll have that today as well. A couple of things. The boards always ask me to take a minute or so to cover the course objectives at the beginning of any workshop. And so there are 6 things here, but we're going to talk about a lot more than these 6 things. But one, I want to be able to talk about how storytelling can be integrated into work with both children and adults. Notice the client who I read The Wizard of Oz to in my office on Monday was 62. Storytelling is appropriate with all of our clients of all ages. My thought when I mapped this out was, I bet you I get a lot of therapists who work with kids. I wonder how many adult therapists are going to show up. Glad to see a lot of adult therapists have showed up. The reason why is storytelling is, of course, appropriate for all ages. Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
All the way from Ada, Oklahoma.
Oh, yes.
We're going to talk about the specific responses stories produce. When James read Where the Wild Things Are, okay, not out of the book, but off of a piece of paper, what was going on there was really pretty interesting. I opened my eyes for a minute, and I watched the people in the room for a minute. And it was interesting. What was going on is what is called a transderivational search. A transderivational search simply means that I have to look inside of myself to figure out what my experience is. That's what we want our clients to be doing during therapy. We want them to be looking inside of themselves, because when we look inside of ourselves, that's where we find the resources to problem solve, and it's also where we find the questions that need to be asked. And it's where we find the direction that's important. James and I were actually driving around town yesterday, and there are a lot more panhandlers on the street corners at this time of year than there are any other time of year. And we went from the hotel over to Whole Foods, and there had to be like every underpass and overpass and every stoplight there was a panhandler, and they had really lousy signs. They had signs that said, you know, we'll work for food, you know, screw that, let's be honest, I need a beer, please help, you know, veteran needs your help, you know, these kind of things. And I said to James, because we both like to play with words and we like to play with language, I said, what we need to do is we need to have a contest. And what we need to do in our contest is we need to change their signs and then see who collects the most money. And so we came up with a couple of signs. And I've actually done this before with the panhandlers in Tulsa. But my favorite sign to give them is one that says, what would you need if you were hungry? Because every time we walk past a panhandler and the sign says, we'll work for food, I'm looking at them. But if they want a response, they need to have the person with the money look at themselves. And so if the sign says, what would you need if you were hungry, instead of looking at the panhandler and his position in life, I need to look at myself. And I may be handing him the money, but I'm answering the question for myself. That's a transderivational search. You came up with a great sign yesterday. What was it?
Well, now I'm not sure whether it was you or I that came up with it, but I know one of the best was, what are you getting for Christmas?
That's right. What a great sign, because it causes a transderivational search. If you were driving down the street and you saw a panhandler and his sign said, what are you getting for Christmas? It would cause you to look inside of yourself to produce a response. And that's what these stories do. So one of the things that we're going to be looking at is how can storytelling and metaphor be used to generate insight, awareness, questioning, and response, and really a therapeutic process within the framework of a story or storytelling. The third objective here is we're going to give you specific stories, metaphors, fables, parables that you can integrate into your counseling. I did a training last February or March or April, I don't remember when it was. James was there, and I kept telling the story during my presentation of how I was a bad storyteller. And so for, I think, it was a 3-week class. It was 2 days a week for 3 weeks. And so from the very beginning to the very end of the class, I would continually tell stories about how I was a bad storyteller. And one of the things that was interesting is I'm actually a pretty good storyteller.
An excellent storyteller, yeah. And we were all just sort of snickering. You know, this idea.
I knew it was a hurricane going on. I know that I'm a decent storyteller. What I meant by that was I'm not really good at creating stories. I'm not really good at coming up with a story off the top of my head. I'm not a creative writer. There's a difference between a creative writer and that would be James, and an awesome storyteller. And so I tell a lot of stories in therapy, but I need to know those stories in advance. If you walk into my office, what you're going to find is you're actually going to find books. These books were actually in my office. I brought them over here, one on Celtic Tales and Thomas the Engine, and my copy of Where the Wild Things Are. Everyone's got a copy. I have a lot of other stories as well. There are tons of poetry books in my office. There are tons of fables, other stories, etc. And on my little Kindle app over here, there are a lot of stories. And one of my favorite books is titled Therapeutic Metaphors. That's the title of the book, Therapeutic Metaphors. And it's just a recipe book of metaphors and kind of like, you can sit up here, it's okay, right up here, kind of like church at the front row. We won't even spit, I promise. And so we're going to share with you specific stories that you can actually take home with you and that you can actually use with clients.
Before you run into that next thing, I have to object, though, because the best story that you told that entire time, and I think you may even be planning to tell it later, and you told it last night in your webinar, is a story from your own life.
Right, I'm going to tell
so
a
you
story
did create a story.
I did create a story.
Tell it very well.
That's right.
Don't believe it.
So I'm going to tell a story later today. You are also a fortune teller.
Oh, hey.
That would be a fortune teller.
A meta-fortune teller.
A meta-fortune teller, yeah, there you go. We're going to talk about how to use this story to confront with empathy, which is what I did in my session on Monday. We're going to talk about using stories to motivate the unmotivated client and using metaphor to make suggestive change even more effective. And the cool thing about storytelling and metaphor is that there is a long history of storytelling and metaphor in the field of psychology, counseling, social work, mental health professions. So those are the objectives today. That's the schedule today. That's the pace at what we're going to do things. And I thought to myself, even though everybody here is a well-educated, degreed, licensed professional, we should probably start out with some definitions. Because one of the things that I've discovered is not only do we pronounce words differently in different parts of the country, but sometimes from different backgrounds or different fields, we have different understandings even of the same word. For example, the definition of atonement. That's a religious word, and some of you know my degrees are in ministry and in religion. And when I first became a therapist, remember back in the 80s, John Bradshaw was doing things on PBS, on the shame in the family, etc. And he kept using the word atonement at one minute, and he was using a word I was very familiar with from my theological training with an entirely different definition. I became really confused. And so sometimes we have different backgrounds. We can actually have different definitions or understandings of what these things are. So to make sure we're on the same page, I said, hey, James, type up a list of definitions. And so he did.
All right, well, first one here is, of course, story. And I think I went to Merriam-Webster for their definition. It's an account of imaginary or real people and events. And I put parentheses around told for entertainment. Because, of course, we're going to be telling stories for more than just entertainment. I'm not totally convinced that entertainment is ever just entertainment. And you know, the interesting thing about a story is that not only are you taking imaginary or real events, you're editing them. You're cutting out certain things. When Richard told his story of that very special day that he's going to get to later, I'm sure there were all kinds of things that happened that day that weren't important to the story, that he edited out. And if you've ever watched any reality TV, I know nobody here has, right? Yeah, we don't. Yeah, we all have. They take things that really happen, supposedly, we trust at least that much, and then they edit them to create a story out of it. They tease the story from it. So, every story has a protagonist, a main character, the hero, and usually the audience is going to identify with that main character. Not always. Sometimes we're going to identify with a secondary character. For instance, in the Sherlock Holmes stories, it's often a little bit more easy to identify with Watson rather than Sherlock Holmes. And that's really what Watson is there for, is so that we have someone we can identify with, because none of us are as brilliant as Sherlock Holmes. Now, that hero, that protagonist, has some kind of challenge. It might be an antagonist, meaning the villain, the bad guy, the person who's opposed to what the protagonist wants. It might be a challenge, it might be a conflict, and traditionally there are three kinds of conflict. This is the English major version of therapy and problems that you face. And those are, in the old traditional terms, man versus man. which is really protagonist versus antagonist. It doesn't matter gender, race, species, your protagonist could be a dog. Basically an encounter between two individuals that are roughly equal. And then you have what they used to call man versus the universe, or man versus government, man versus the world. Basically the protagonist against something bigger than the protagonist. It might be a storm. It might be the forces of nature. It might be the forces of bureaucracy. It might be a social setting. Something that's not an individual, but that the protagonist struggles against. And then, and this is a really interesting one, you have man versus himself. The internal conflict that the protagonist deals with. And I think the best stories work on all of those levels. And you have those struggles occurring in each way. And I think if you look at your clients, you'll discover that most of them are encountering one or all of those conflicts in some way. Now, that conflict has to lead to a resolution. And we're all familiar with this, right? Have you ever had to leave a movie early? Right? And you're like, but I want to see how it ends. You know, my friends do that, and I always say, he defeats the bad guy, the girl goes with him, that other girl goes with that other guy, and we're done. And they're like, but I wanted the resolution, right? I've even been in movies where I felt like there wasn't enough resolution. It didn't resolve well. And the funny thing is that life doesn't resolve, right? It just keeps going. And yet, for a story to work, we have to resolve the conflict. Now, I don't think I have to really be explicit to point out how that's going to apply in a therapeutic setting. We're helping our clients to resolve the conflicts in their life and to see how that can be done. Because really, every story is about change. Just like every therapeutic interaction is about change. And, you know, when I first heard that, I thought, really? Is every single story is about change? Well, now occasionally there are stories that are simply descriptions. Ursula Le Guin wrote a story called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. If you haven't read it, check it out. It's a short story, won't take you long to read. And it's all description. It's simply a description of this fictional town called Omelas. By the way, she named it late one night when she was driving past Salem, Oregon. She saw Salem O, and she's just, you know, one of those people who reads everything backwards for the fun of it. And in the story, nothing happens. It's all a description of the town and the people who live in the town. What happens is a change in the reader. The reader's perception of what's going on changes, and that's where that change occurs. So anytime that you're looking at a story, look for what changes, because that's really what stories are built around.
I like how you say this. If there's no change, there's really no story.
It's true. Yeah, there really isn't. So look for the change, and let your clients keep the change. Sorry, I just had to throw in a bad slogan.
By the way, you are gonna have to be quick-witted with James around. You can be dumb-witted and do just fine with me, but with James around, you're going to have to be quick-witted. So we will throw those out like a sword.
Yeah. All right. So, in the last of the literary terms I wanted to throw out there is theme, and of course, in literature, theme doesn't mean the same as topic. It's a statement. It's a message that you want to get across. It's the moral of the story. And that moral of the story might be explicit. In other words, it might be stated outright. And, we all remember Aesop's fables from childhood, where the story is told, and then at the end, the storyteller states the moral of the story. The moral of the story is, don't count your chickens before they hatch. right? And the funny thing about that is that even though the moral is stated, it's still metaphorical. I mean, that's not really a story about eggs and chickens, right? It's really a story about thinking in a top-down way, about assuming things are going to happen when they're not going to, or we don't know they will. But more often, the theme or the moral of a story is going to be implicit. And that's really where we get into that transderivational search that Richard was talking about, where we wonder, what is the meaning, what is the message that's coming across? And that's the beauty of a story, is that it can force the audience or your client to work out that message.
And let me jump in with the therapeutic value there. How many of you work with adolescents, or at least have worked with adolescents? Well, how many of you have adolescents? One of the things that is interesting about adolescents is that when they've come to see me in my office, they see me wearing a sport coat, they see me with a button-down shirt, they see me with a diploma hanging on the wall, they see me with the accoutrements of my office, my plush furniture, because it's my office, and so it's actually a nice office. And they come in, and their first thought is, this person is not like me. This person can't relate to me. This person doesn't understand the pain that I'm going through. He's an old guy. He's got everything. He's not like me at all. That is their first perceptual position as an adolescent coming to see an adult therapist. What the hell is going on?
Termites.
Termites. Okay. Sorry, those of you who are at home, we keep occasionally having earthquakes here, I guess, in central Oklahoma. But the adolescent comes in and they see me as not like them. I might know the moral. The moral that they might need in order to make successful change is, don't count your chickens before you hatch, because adolescents are known for being impulsive. That may be a valuable lesson. But if I simply said to them, whoa, you need to slow down, you need to take more time, I know exactly what they should do. It was Albert Ellis who actually taught us in therapy not to should on our clients. Well, if we can't should on our clients, what should we do? We should tell them a story. Because in that story, they can look inside of themselves and find the same answers that they would reject if I told them what they should do. And that's really the beauty of the moral themes. For some of my clients, their solution really is pretty simple to solving the problems that really are enormous. But they'll reject what I tell them. It would be easy for me in my wisdom of working with many people over the years to say to a client, I've worked with many people over the years. The ones who are successful are the ones who did that. The ones who are unsuccessful are the ones who did this. You should do that. Guess what? They won't do it. It's my idea. Just like the sign, will work for food, keeps the focus on somebody outside of the person who can take action. The focus needs to be on them. And those stories bring those morals. What about metaphors? What is a metaphor?
Brazen. Sorry.
It's going to be a long day.
I might stand up, but I don't stand. I can't stand that long, so I sit down to do comedy. Now, actually, before we get into metaphor, though, I wanted to touch on something that you said there. You mentioned that a client would often reject something if you stated it outright. And the beauty of a story is that not only do you not have to state it outright, but in order to enjoy a story, you have to shut down the part of you that rejects things. You have to suspend disbelief. Because, let's face it, would we really be able to enjoy Star Wars if we thought, I just don't buy that all of these aliens, some of them look like us and others don't, and how do they communicate? And, if you start trying to pick it apart, you're never going to be able to enjoy the story. So we actually have kind of that magic phrase that says, hey, it's okay, it's just a story, right? Once upon a time, in a galaxy far, far away. And so you shut down that part of you that goes, I don't believe this. And you enter into a hypothetical experience. And that's when you can slip that moral into them. That's
and the therapeutic process here is the therapeutic process of testing. How many times have you said to a client, try it, see what happens? I know you don't think that would be helpful to you, but why don't you try it and then tell me next week what happens when you tried it? Well, a story encourages a person to try it because they might like it by suspending that disbelief. So the therapeutic value of a story, even a story that is out of a book, like Where the Wild Things Are, is a story that suspends that disbelief, that causes that transderivational search, that asks a person to take the test. Most of my clients, I give them a dry erase marker. All my clients, I give them a dry erase marker, except the inherent abusers. The rest of them get a dry erase marker. And I want them to write on the bathroom mirror the counters to their cognitive errors. It's the first thing they see in the morning. It's the last thing they see at the end of the day. But my clients don't believe what they wrote was true. But when they see in their own handwriting on the bathroom mirror the counter to their cognitive error, after a week or 2 or 3 of it being there, one day they're going to say, I wonder if that's true. And they're going to test to find out. And that's really what cognitive behavioral therapy is all about. And so in a way we could say that Albert Ellis was just a storyteller. Because stories have been doing that for thousands of years.
Yes, and using metaphor.
What is a metaphor?
Grazing. Hey, they got it this time. All right.
Keep your day job. Metaphor.
I've already quit my day job.
The reason I wanted to define metaphor here in the workshop is because metaphor is widely used in a lot of different therapeutic disciplines. And so it's in the textbook. But I do a lot of training for people, as you know, who have advanced degrees and have taken these training programs, and they're really still not sure what a metaphor is. Because for some reason, professors like to make a metaphor a lot more complex than it really is. And when you leave here today, you're going to know how to use metaphors in therapy. How many of you are familiar with Stephen Hayes' work, ACT therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy? Stephen Hayes is a researcher from the University of Nevada who spent most of the last 20 years writing on social anxiety and anxiety disorder treatment. Anyone? ACT therapy? I'll give you some of the books that he wrote, and then maybe you'll recognize the books. Probably his most popular book is Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life. So if you don't recognize his name, you recognize his book. And even though a lot of hands aren't going up, no doubt that you've been colored by his work because he's one of the predominant current writers in the field of therapy. And if you're reading any journals, you're probably seeing his name pop up every now and then. One of the things I really appreciate about ACT therapy, which by the way is an evidence-based or outcome-based treatment protocol for the treatment of anxiety disorders, is the heavy use of metaphor and storytelling. And I just recommend, I have a client who I'm seeing right now who's afraid to fly, fear of flying. I actually recommended for him that as part of the therapy that he actually buy the book, Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life. The reason why is there are a lot of stories and metaphors in there that I wanted to be able to use with him in relation to his fear of flying. So that can be a great source. Not quite so current, but a long time ago in a galaxy far away, Arizona, Milton Erickson. How many of you are familiar with Milton Erickson's work? There we go. Many more hands go up. And I was trained in Ericksonian hypnotherapy. James is a hypnotherapist, and the approach of Milton Erickson. And Milton Erickson really was a master storyteller. And the majority of his therapeutic work came in the form of metaphors and storytelling. And I'm even going to tell you later on today some of Milton Erickson's stories. The reason why, they're stories that I actually tell to my clients. And when I tell these stories to you, you will probably leave here today and tell those stories to your clients. But certainly in Ericksonian hypnotherapy, and Erickson psychology, we see a dependence on metaphor. So, what is a metaphor?
Metaphor literally means, if I recall correctly, to carry across. And so you carry across a meaning from one thing, event, idea, story to another.
So it's like a bridge.
It is a bridge.
Is that a metaphor?
That is a metaphor. Very
So
good. Yes.
a bridge could be a metaphor for a metaphor.
That would make it a meta-metaphor.
So,
Or a
so,
metaphor.
so I just told a metaphor in 3.7 seconds. I'm the world's fastest metaphorist.
You need to register that now.
World's fastest metaphorist.
Metaphorist.com.
I think that this is where the hang-up with metaphor comes from. We often think that metaphor needs to be a beautiful, scripted, 3-page story. And a metaphor is simply something that conveys an idea across one representational system to another representational system. It can be short, like, is that a bridge? Or it could be long, and we'll get into long metaphors later.
I had a client a few weeks ago who he was coming up for his follow-up. He had stopped smoking with me about 3 days before. And he came in and he was just telling me stories about his life. And I knew that he had started smoking when he was about 10. And he had stopped smoking about 3 days ago. And he runs a sawmill that he and his brother inherited from their father. And his brother drives him nuts. His brother, he says, my brother's always coming up to me saying, we got to do this, we got to do that. And my brother doesn't know anything. That wasn't the term he used. And so I've gotten really good at ignoring. And I've gotten really good at just saying, yeah, whatever, you don't know. And just going on with my life. I said, yeah, you know, is your brother older or younger? And he said, older, but I still know more. I'm like, yeah, you know, experience-wise, you're older. It's like, he's like a 10-year-old kid. And he's like, yeah, he is like a 10-year-old kid. I'm like, you know, 10-year-old kids come up with dumb ideas. And he's like, yeah, they do. And I said, so it's almost like he's a 10-year-old kid saying, hey, you got to do this, you got to do that. And it's almost like there's a 10-year-old inside you saying, hey, you got to smoke, because smoking's a great idea. And you can just look at that 10-year-old and say, no, to heck with that. I know better than that. You're dumb. And he went, oh, wow. So that's just a tiny little metaphor. Right there, carrying it from his brother to that part of himself.
And metaphor is really a great way to communicate with clients. It causes, again, that transderivational search. It confronts in a very non-confrontational way. I don't know how many of you are great at doing a Fritz Perls imitation with clients. You ever do that? You get up in their face, you start swearing at them, you get in the now, you start yelling at them. I could yell at the webcam, get in the now, no! With a German accent and a cigarette hanging out, nicotine-stained beard. I was actually trained in Gestalt therapy. That was the first approach. And I was actually, my story, number 5 out of 7 kids in an ACOA people-pleasing kind of family. I was the one, because I was number 5 out of 7, who had to sit in the seat facing the wrong direction in the 1973 Vista Loser station wagon. Because remember, it held 9 people. There were 3 kids in the back looking the wrong direction. That was me. And so I don't really want to rock the boat. I'm not. I'm a people pleaser. Look, I've been like the waiter of this meeting, okay? James was talking over here, getting handouts, moving chairs. I'm the usher. You know, I'm doing all these people, you know, talking to these people, trying to make sure their volume is okay. I'm not good at not being the host. I'm not good at confrontation. And I remember I was actually, you know, originally trained in substance abuse counseling, and we'd put them in a circle, we'd put somebody in the hot seat, and we'd go Gestalt on them. And I remember I was like, wow, I can't be a therapist. I'm not good at confrontation. Fortunately, I learned quickly that confrontation isn't about doing a bad Fritz Perls imitation. It's about using the strength of your personality to communicate what it is that your client needs to know. And storytelling, metaphor in particular, and parable are all ways to do this in a rather gentle way. And I actually like the gentle way. It's really a whole lot easier. And I've worked with some pretty difficult folks. In Texas, right near James area, I worked level 6 DHS kids. I've worked with the probation departments. I've worked with, you know, I graduated with a master's degree in counseling, I think, when I was 22. No one wants a 22-year-old therapist. So I got the jobs that nobody else wanted. And those were always with highly difficult clients. And I've always done real well in them. even though I'm not good at getting up in their face and cussing at them and telling them to get in the now, because I'm good at using those bridges to let them confront themselves. That's really what storytelling is all about. James's example of having the smoker confront himself in the way that he wanted to confront his brother makes perfect sense.
I was proud of myself.
Let's talk about parables, since I have a degree in ministry.
All right, parables are fantastic. And of course, we're all familiar with parables. I assume that you went to Sunday school at some point, or you knew someone who went to Sunday school at some point.
Now, are there parables that aren't from Jesus?
There are absolutely parables that aren't from Jesus. Really, any teaching tale. And I didn't include myth in the definitions, but many myths serve as parables. Celtic myths.
A visual representation.
And, you know, one of the most famous parables, of course, is the parable of the Good Samaritan, that talks about how these people of high social status wouldn't stop to help someone who was wounded, but this person who was looked down upon would. And that teaches us a lesson. And virtually every myth, and here's the thing, when I was, you know, in second, third grade, and they introduced us to well, they didn't actually use Bullfinch's mythology, because it's a very dense book that you wouldn't want to throw at a second grader, unless you were angry. Don't throw those people. But they introduced us to Greco-Roman mythology, and they said, these were stories that explained nature before we had science. And okay, yeah, that's kind of true. The story of Persephone, the goddess of spring, who falls in love, basically, or well, it depends on your version, but gets carried away by the you know, lord of the underworld and has to stay there, and the world mourns and winter comes on, and that was all explained to us. Oh, this is all about spring and winter and all of that. But as I looked at that myth more when I was an adult, I thought, Persephone means she who loves darkness. And when she first, you know, she's led this beautiful life of always living in spring. It's always been flowers and puppies and sunshine and butterflies for her. And one day she's picking a flower and it tears the earth and there's dirt underneath. She's never seen dirt. And she's amazed by dirt. And then this horrific lord of the underworld with skulls and snakes and black clothing and heavy metal music comes out. Right? And she is crazy about him and runs away with him to the end. All right. Okay. Are we starting to see a little bit of where this story applies to people? So myths, parables are not just stories that explain something about nature. They explain something about the psyche of the human being.
Absolutely. Parables are a great place to look for stories that are applicable and useful in therapy. And most of us think, I think particularly in Oklahoma, parable means parable of Jesus. Jesus was just a good parable teller. There are lots of parables, modern parables, older parables, and of course, biblical parables. Trance. Now we have to talk about trance, because it's impossible to talk about storytelling without talking about trance. And James and I are both professional hypnotists. My office is the Tulsa Hypnosis Clinic. If you make an appointment with me, I'm going to hypnotize you, because that's what I do. And the majority of people come to see me for issues that they would see a hypnotist for. For example, I help people stop smoking, and James, his tagline is, your Austin Hypnosis.
Austin's Quit Smoking Headquarters.
There you go. And the bread and butter of a hypnotist is actually smoking cessation. Now, I kind of like to tell this story about my work in smoking cessation, because I came from working with inmates, substance abusers, and heroin addicts, and now I'm just working with cigarette smokers. It doesn't seem so important, does it? Until you realize that I save lives, I save marriages, I save money. I never really realized until 2006, when I began doing primarily smoking cessation hypnosis, the impact that it was going to have in people's lives. Just a couple of months back, I had a lady who was the majority of my clients are in their 50s and 60s. people don't see a hypnotist first. For some reason, they think it's a witch doctor, as opposed to a therapist who's been trained in professional therapy. I don't know why, but maybe Hollywood does that. And so people come to see me last. So she was in her 60s, and she came to see me because she had just received a diagnosis of leukemia. And she was actually on her way down to Houston to Ben Taub or to MD Anderson Cancer Center for treatment. And she had one grandson who was 2.5 years old, and she did not know if she was going to live for 4 more weeks, 4 more months, 4 more years, or even 40 more years. She had no idea. But she knew one thing, that if she quit smoking today, whether she had 4 weeks or 4 months or 4 years left or 40 years left, the quality of her life was going to improve dramatically, and the recovery process from the treatment she was going to be receiving would be easier, which meant that even if she only had 4 more weeks left or 4 more months left, she would be able to spend that time enjoying her grandson rather than struggling for a last breath. And so out of desperation, she came to see me, not so she could quit smoking, but so that she could enjoy love. Our deepest need, security, significance, to love other people, to receive love in return, a sense of belonging. She left my office a non-smoker, and I felt honored to have had the chance to work with her, because I recognize that even though that grandson will never know who I am, he got a gift from his grandmother that will be valuable to him for the rest of his life. So I really enjoyed the work of being a hypnotist, helping people to quit smoking, because we actually get to do really important things. I think that sometimes people think hypnotists do something, and I always explain to people, as a hypnotist, I don't do anything to anybody. In fact, my job is to take people out of trance as much as it is to put them into trance. Trance is not a magical, mystical state like Hollywood. We are always in trance. Sometimes we're in our parenting trance, or teaching trance, or sitting in a workshop trance, collecting CEU hours at the end of the year trance. Sometimes we're in our anxiety trance because we miscounted the hours and now realize we have to sit through a webinar between Christmas Day and January 1st. Sometimes the opposite, we're in our happy trance because we realize that we actually had enough hours and that we don't need to go to any more continuing education. And so we have our driving trance. You drive home, you've been on the phone the whole time. How did you do that? How did you drive a complicated machinery while distracted on a phone? Because you drove in trance. It was Milton Erickson who said he would not want a New York City taxi driver that was not in trance, because that's the automatic subconscious mind doing the driving. So trance is mysterious because of Igor and Hollywood, take me to your leader. But what I do as a hypnotist, or we do as a therapist, is really trance utilization. Now sometimes people say to me, all right, so you're a hypnotist, but I don't do that kind of stuff. I guarantee you, when you're in your office, in your chair, your therapy chair, the chair you go to for the ritual of doing therapy with a client, and the client comes in and they set at the door all of those difficulties and problems in their real world, and they sit in your therapy couch or your therapy chair. Even if you never count backwards from 1 to 10, they are in a trance state. They're in a safe place. For how many of your clients have really awful lives, and when they're in your office, it's at least the one safe place they have? You know, I think the value of therapy with children is not in the techniques that we use. Sometimes for some children, that 1 hour in our office is the only time they can feel safe. And that teaches them something valuable, that even though it doesn't feel safe out here in the real world, I can be safe. That's a very valuable lesson. And so we induce trance with or without hypnosis all day long. When James starts reading a story, it raises his voice for dramatic emphasis in where the wild things are. Whatever else you were thinking about before that moment simply disappeared, and all of your attention was focused on James, if even for a moment. And it changed the direction of the course of where you placed your thoughts. That's trance. And so storytelling produces trance. Have you ever wondered, how did the librarian get all those little kids to shut the heck up and sit there quietly? Because storytelling puts a person in trance.
It is. It's entrancing. And we're familiar with that idea. Now, when Richard was telling the story about that grandmother that he helped stop smoking, how many of you got that warm feeling? Did you get that? Yeah. All right. Yeah, I got that too. Now, you know, if you go see a stage hypnotist, right, he gets all of his volunteers up there and he says, all right, I want you to imagine that you're on the beach and it's a really sunny day and you feel warm. And they all feel warm. So what was the difference between those two? One of them was called hypnosis, the other's called storytelling. And so through telling that story, he actually elicited an emotion from all of you, just as effectively, perhaps more effectively, than if he had said, all right, we're going to do a hypnotic process here.
And we don't only elicit an emotion, we also elicit that sensation. Let me give you an example of how a story can actually elicit a physical sensation. And this is really important because I know we see clients as mental health professionals for mental issues, psychological issues, anxiety, fear, phobia, depression, anger, those sorts of things. But how many of your clients' emotional condition is complicated or compromised by their physical state? I've always said you can only be as well emotionally as you are physically. And through a trance induction or a trance state, which we can do through storytelling, we can actually affect a person physically. Sometimes my clients come into my office and they say, I'm 400 pounds, I've been ruled out from bariatric surgery, I've already tried every diet, I'm 48 years old, if I don't lose half my body weight, I'm going to die. How am I going to do this? Am I going to simply close my eyes and open my eyes and I'll be 100 pounds lighter? I don't understand how this is going to help me. Or my pain control clients, they come in and they say, but you don't understand, my arthritis really is real. It's just they haven't been able to make the pain go away and the medications don't work and all these things. How are you going to help me physically? I understand you can help me feel better emotionally, but how are you going to help me physically? And let me tell you a story. The story I'm telling you, not the clients. How many of you remember when you were a kid, you went to the movie theater and you had those lemon head candies, those Moorhead candies? Remember those? They were hard candy, sugary on the outside, lemon on the inside. Go ahead and hold out your hand. And imagine that I'm running around the room. I'm not because of all the cords, but imagine that I'm running around the room and I'm putting some imaginary lemon head candy in everyone's hand, okay? So you all have some imaginary lemon head candy in your hand, okay? Now, go ahead and close your eyes and just hold that imaginary candy and then take the other hand and grab that imaginary candy and pop that imaginary candy into your mouth. And as soon as you do, taste that sugary exterior of that hard candy, that sweet exterior of that lemon head candy, and it of course begins to melt away and gives way to that sour lemon, that tart lemon interior as that sugar completely melts away. Now chop up that imaginary candy, chop, 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 and swallow the tart lemon imaginary candy. And then open your eyes and put your hand down because I'm out of imaginary candy and can't give you any more. By round of applause. Wait, I haven't asked a question. By round of applause. How many of you, when I said lemon head candy, tart bitter lemon candy, felt salivation in your mouth? I told you a story or guided you through a process that didn't just produce an emotional response, oh, I loved the movies when I was a kid. Or I hated going to the movies when I was a kid. Or even sadness, I remember when my family was going to the movie, but they didn't take me to see, what was that Black Horse movie? Black Stallion. There you go. I didn't get to see that. You know, the story elicited an emotion, but guess what? It also elicited a physical response. You salivated. And if you didn't salivate, how many of you, by a round of applause, could taste the lemon candy or the sugar candy? And if you didn't experience any of those things, how many of you could feel the weight of that candy in your hand? I called this imaginary candy the whole time. I never said, make this real to you. I just kept calling it imaginary candy. And throughout that process, you produced not only an emotional response, but you also produced a physical response. So when I'm working with clients in therapy, if I have a client who is in a tremendous amount of pain, I can use storytelling to elicit not just a change in an emotional state, but I can elicit a change in their physical state. I've had clients who've come in and they've been very uncomfortable. Again, the majority of my clients, it's weird, I used to do mostly adolescents, and then I had my own adolescents and didn't want to see anyone else's adolescents. So now most of the clients I see are 50 and 60. So probably, in fact, I won't make an appointment with an adolescent anymore. I have my own, in fact, my own adolescents are almost all done being adolescents, and I never want to see another one again. So now, the majority of my clients are 50 and 60, and they have significant physical distress. And it's amazing to see how comfort can be elicited through storytelling, or a belief in wellness being something attainable to them can bring a connection to a moment of change. And really, that's what trance is all about. You want to define therapy?
Well, I define therapy there on the list as an activity or interaction intended to bring about rehabilitation or social adjustment. But I think that we are all pretty clear that therapy is about change, and stories are about change. So I think very quickly we can say stories are a form of therapy, and therapy really is about helping your client change their story. Identity is a story we tell ourselves about ourselves. Have you ever met somebody who said, "So what's your story?"
I'm number 5 out of 7 in an ACOA people-pleasing kind of family.
Yeah. See, people don't like the idea of those labels. They don't like the idea of being a statistic or something on a chart. They're an individual. They've got a story. And that kind of segues into the idea of the role of the storyteller.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the role of the storyteller and storytelling in culture. It's an act of magical creation.
Yeah, the word spell, as in a magic spell, originally means story. We still have that word hanging around in the word gospel, which means the good story. We also have another version of it in the word spiel. And the word for storyteller...
So let me give you my spiel.
Yeah, the spiel. In the Scandinavian languages, a fiddler or a storyteller is called a spieleman. A man with a spiel, a man with a story. The word for poet in a lot of languages means creator. Someone who creates things, because they create a world within the mind of the listener. And, not only is the individual identity defined by stories, but our cultural identity is defined by stories. Now, I come from Texas, right? And did you hear the pride in the way I say Texas?
And by the way, just to make clear, I'm a native Texan, merely living in exile in Oklahoma.
and it's funny, because, I was never the person who fit in. I really shouldn't have all this Texas pride, but by golly, I do. And even though I have a friend who's a history major, and every time we mention the Alamo, he just goes, that's nonsense. There's no evidence that things like that happened. It's very questionable. And he just goes off on all of the good factual information that we can derive from the primary sources about the Alamo. And I look at him and say, I don't care. A bunch of brave Texans died for their freedom at that place, by golly, because that's the story. And that's my cultural identity. So when you look at the stories that somebody's telling about themselves, telling about their family, telling about their culture, all of that is going to play into how they look at themselves, and often why they're in your office.
Self-identity is certainly one of the number one issues in therapy. Now, here's a question, and the question is, what's your favorite story? What's your favorite story? My favorite story of all time is a story called The Cat from Telegraph Hill. When I was a kid, I was probably 5 or 6, and Santa left it in my stocking. And it even had a vinyl record that I could play on the record player that actually read the story to me. And that was my favorite story. And I don't know what happened. Somewhere between 5 and 7 or 8, it got lost and nowhere to be found, and then moves and all those things. And I never forgot that story. And my grandfather gave me an excellent idea. It was actually the year before my grandfather died. He lived to be 98, so this was just a few years ago. Now that we have the power of the internet, My grandfather, I said to him, what would you like for Christmas? He was probably 96 or 97. He said, can you get me a book? So what? Sure, what book do you want? He said, can you get me a 1932 University of Illinois yearbook? I said, what? He said, I don't know, can you use that internet thing and find a 1932 University of Illinois yearbook? And I said, I honestly don't know. Why? He said, oh, there's a picture of me in there. I said, a picture of you in there? What are you doing in the picture? He said, well, I was Chief Illiniwek, University of Illinois. He said, and so I'd like to see that. So I actually went back to my house and I got on Google and typed in 1932 University of Illinois yearbook, and boom, they're for sale all over the place. So I got one for like $50 and I brought it to him. And it's interesting, when a person is in the last year of life, their house becomes smaller, becomes an apartment, their spouse dies, it becomes a 2-room room at the, assisted living, it becomes one hospital room. What's the stuff that's still in that room?
Pictures.
It's interesting. And that yearbook made it to that last room. So I thought, wow, he found his book. I wonder if I can find my book. So I got online and looked for the Cat from Telegraph Hill, the plastic record, and I found it, and I still have it. I didn't bring it because I didn't want to beat it up and lose it in the car, because it's actually important to me. But you can go to YouTube and type in the Cat from Telegraph Hill, and you can hear me do a dramatic reading of the Cat from Telegraph Hill. By the way, I did that and posted it online, because everything you put online will be there forever. In other words, the moral of the story is, be careful what you post. It will follow you for eternity. But that's my favorite story. What are some of your favorite stories? What are some of your favorite stories? It's Christmas time around here, so maybe even a Christmas story. What are some of your favorite stories? We know one of his is Where the Wild Things Are. Mine is the Cat from Telegraph Hill, about a cat in San Francisco. What are some of your favorite stories?
Alice in Wonderland.
Alice in Wonderland. Definitely. And Tom Petty's favorite story, too.
Dr. Seuss.
Dr. Seuss stories. Cat in the Hat. It was interesting, when Dr. Seuss died, Jesse Jackson on Saturday Night Live did a dramatic reading of Green Eggs and Ham. And it was not a disrespectful thing. It was actually it was a tribute to Dr. Seuss. And it was really, there's probably not a better voice for reading Green Eggs and Ham than Jesse Jackson. It was really pretty awesome. And so ever since that dramatic reading by Jesse Jackson of the Green Eggs and Ham, I've loved that story even more. So certainly Dr. Seuss stories. What other stories have been your favorite?
Currently, Life of Pi.
Okay, Life of Pi.
Ben and Huckleberry Finn.
Huckleberry Finn?
Yeah, put it there.
The Last Unicorn.
The Last Unicorn. Okay.
Frosty the Snowman.
Frosty the Snowman. There you go. I posted that online. I posted the entire original Frosty the Snowman on my Facebook group called It's Almost Christmas Time. You can join it and you can watch the video. Kathy watched it. Or at least saw me post it. Well, I posted the whole original version up there.
I like Babe the Blue Ox.
Babe the Blue Ox. There you go. Yeah.
The Velveteen Rabbit.
The Velveteen Rabbit. That's another great story. Yeah.
The Little Match Girl.
Little Massacre. Okay. Now these are all stories that have been published stories. How about stories that we might not know about, but is there a favorite story you were told in your home that was important to you? Yeah.
And Native American, the Little People.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And one of the interesting things about Native American Indians, of course, is the tradition of storytelling as an oral tradition of both preserving and passing down history. And so in Oklahoma, storytelling has a very important tradition, within our state's culture. And certainly the people who are indigenous to this area, or at least were chased to this area.
My mother always made up stories.
What?
I say the Chickasaw Nation
Is
working on getting
recording
elders
the
to
stories.
record the stories,
Absolutely.
and we keep them at the cultural center.
Yeah, absolutely.
My mother always made up stories and incorporated us in them.
There you go.
She was real creative, and I loved her stories, and because we were part of them.
Well, when my kids were little, it was like the beginning of the computer era. And so you could go to the mall and you could buy a book where their name was in it. And so
Yeah,
they became
yeah,
my kids,
later
so it was
that
one of
came
their favorite,
around.
one of their favorite things.
Yeah.
You know, back when I was a kid, in order to have that, you know, your mom would have had to buy Whiteout and, you know, write
Yeah,
it in
and then she just told the
What,
stories.
what are some that, or any other stories important to you? How about religious stories? You know, I think that religious stories can become very important to a person. Let's take the story of the book of Job, for example. Most people are familiar with that story. I like to tell that story to clients. I like to tell that story to myself. By the way, I'm not doing or representing myself as a Christian counselor. Religion never is a part of my counseling process. Certainly I'm respectful of their religion, but generally I leave religion out of the therapeutic work that I do. There's obviously a place for those who are practicing Christian counseling or religious counseling of another faith. There's certainly lots of room for that. But even as a secular counselor, I still tell the story of the book of Job, and I'll usually preface it, because this was an important story to me. I'll usually preface it this way. Whether you share the faith the book of Job's tradition comes from or not is irrelevant to the story of the book of Job. And you're probably already familiar with the story of Job. And most people think that Job is about answering the question, why does bad stuff happen to good people? Let me tell you a condensed version of the book of Job, and this is very condensed. Basically, there's a deal between God and the devil, and all of these bad things happen to Job. And Job's got 3 lousy friends who keep coming along with all of these explanations as to why this is happening to him. And all of those explanations are wrong, because at the end of the book of Job, the young guy basically points out, hey, shut up. Job's lousy friends, there's really something bigger going on than you're ever going to understand. And how do I use that story with clients? Most of my clients are familiar with that story, especially in this part of the country. And they're familiar with that story. And what my clients need to understand is that they don't need to figure out why bad things happen to good people, because that is an emotionally draining, futile effort. I will never understand why babies burn in fires. My father was a firefighter. I'll never understand why only the good die young. I will never understand this or that. But I can grasp the concept that there's something bigger going on than I can understand. And that's really what the whole point of the book of Job is all about. And a lot of my clients need to know that there's really something bigger going on than they can understand. And their job is not to understand. It's to make change today. Understanding may follow later. And that is a great way to frame the process or progress of therapy. Let's take a break. When we come back from our first break of the morning, we're going to look at some stories, some specific stories with pervasive cultural and intergenerational life. We're also going to look at movies as modern mythology, because Hollywood has been busy cranking out stories for the last 20 years. Take a break for 10 minutes. When we come back from our break, we will look at those things.